Fantastic. Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Christy. And it looks like everybody is seeing the welcome screen or welcome mat. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled that all of you have joined us. And I'm honored that you devote an hour of your time to this event and really look forward to engaging with you during the next 60 minutes. Again, we really encourage folks to use the question window, the chat feature, and again, we'll be answering questions after the session as well at McGraw-Hill K through 12 on Twitter. So let's go ahead and get started here. I actually would like to start today by setting context and want to do so through a story. So as most of you know, Quincy Jones, who we're seeing on screen right now, is an award-winning musician and producer. And he has multiple Grammys and Billboard chart toppers. And what struck me was that in an interview, when he was asked how he was able to achieve so many hits, he actually answered, "I never forget that music is conceived in passion." And why this was significant to me was because when you think about all of the digital and modern equipment that he has at his disposal, where he can essentially tinker to get the right sound, the perfect cymbal or the perfect bass drum, he knows that all of the technology in the world won't matter if the music doesn't touch anyone's heart. And so it's technology without purpose that's a distraction. And so today we're going to be talking about purposeful technology, how you leverage the affordances of technology, which is why at McGraw-Hill Education we're committed to purposeful technology. We think words like adaptive and personalized and efficacy are actually at risk of becoming buzzwords for educators in our industry, especially if they don't focus on the purpose. So for us, we think about the higher intention around learning. So for us, adaptivity is about responsiveness. The higher intention of personalization is about when it leads a learner to a changed sense of self. And efficacy is absolutely about outcomes, but it's also about self-efficacy. So what you're seeing on screen here is why we believe it's critical that we stay focused on the teacher and the student relationship, and that it's in this deep understanding of where learning happens and how the mind develops where we see that magic happening. That it's the science of learning and the art of teaching that come together, and when we focus on the purpose, that's where we see the greatest gains. So during the session, you will absolutely hear me come back to this notion of focusing on the learner and focusing on the learning. So with that, what I'd actually like to do is pose the first question of the session. So what you're seeing on screen is that question: what is the purpose of research? And this is where you'll have your first opportunity to kind of move beyond that practice session in the chat window and share your thoughts. And as you do so, Christy's going to call out some of the themes that are emerging. So take a minute, short answers. What is the purpose of research? Again, think about it wearing your teacher hat, or perhaps we have some folks coming from a curriculum specialist, curriculum background. Think about it from your media specialist background. Wear your expert hat and think about the purpose of research.
We're getting some great answers to drive meaningful instruction, a clear, concise way to teach and how to teach, learn from previous eras, to gain more knowledge on a subject. Great answers coming in.
Yeah, what I like about those answers, Christy, is number one, it's pointing us towards the purpose of research writ large, right, to learn from previous eras, for example. But it's also connecting it, I hear in the themes coming back to instruction and teaching. So certainly that's what we want to do, is anchor our discussion around the purpose of research in that connection to education. So one of the first things I'd like to do is actually spend just a minute anchoring ourselves in a common vocabulary. And when we think about the word research, it literally comes from the French root, meaning to search. And we heard this in your responses and in the themes. When we think about what we're searching for, typically you do research to gather evidence or to learn something new. And yet the argument that we're making at McGraw-Hill Education and that I'm making today with you is that the research in and of itself is not sufficient or enough in education, that research has to be balanced, and it has to be balanced against this notion of design, which means to mark out. And when you think about when you're designing something, it really is to solve a problem or to improve an experience. So our job and our purpose is to focus on the interaction between these quadrants, right? We're constantly in education trying to gather evidence to improve an experience or learn something new to solve a problem. So again, it's this balance between design and research that really allows us to validate or invalidate some of our hypotheses about learning. And it's this process that I want to spend just a little bit of time up front setting context around. So what you're seeing on screen here is actually the title of a book that was published in 1962 by Thomas Kuhn. And in his text, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, what he actually did was outline the process of normal science, and he talked about paradigm shifts. So what I want to do with a pretty basic and simple animation on screen is illustrate this concept. And what Kuhn was arguing was that as humans, we observe the world around us looking for patterns. So in this case, we see a big blue circle. Okay? And we move through the world looking for those patterns. We see another big blue circle, another big blue circle. And when something in that pattern changes, so now we have a small yellow circle, so size and color has changed, we start to take note. So now we have a large white circle, and if we keep moving through, we see we've got a small red circle. So now color has changed, size has changed, shape has changed. This is our first indicator as human beings that there's a paradigm shift. And this becomes significant because what we know is that learning changes everything, right? It's the mechanism that we have to change our lives, and yet the nature of learning itself is changing, right? It gives us an opportunity and choice to become self-actualized and connect with our community, yet moreover, we know that how we understand the brain, how we process information, how we learn as human beings is in and of itself becoming more visible to us as human beings. So what we know is that the nature of learning is changing in a myriad of ways, right? And what I'd like to do is actually think about some of the ways that we know it's changing. And one interesting sort of touch point is what's called the mindset list. And this is a list that Beloit College actually publishes every August. And it's a bit of a cultural touchstone. So it gives examples that inform the worldview of students who are entering college and the career force every year. So for instance, if you take a look at the mindset list for 2015, you'll see that students who are entering the college and the career force have always known PC as something that represents a personal computer, not the concept of political correctness, right? Electric cars have always been on the road during their lifetime. And music, for example, has always been available via downloads. So if we think about some of these major mindset worldview notions that students are grappling with, what we know about our target audience is that in the lifetime of students who are entering college and the career force, they have always lived at a time when we have had genome mapping and DNA fingerprinting. And those same students have never had to twist a coiled handset around their wrist while chatting on the phone. The phone has always been something different, ubiquitous. And those same students have always lived in a time when computers were able to be equipped with a CD-ROM, let alone talk about the cloud, for example. So what we know about the nature of learning is changing. What we know about the nature of learners is changing. And yet what we also know is that what typically was invisible to us as humans and as educators is now becoming visible. So for instance, I want to take kind of a 3-beat history lesson on what we know around our metaphors for learning, because those are changing as well. So if we flash back to the middle of the 1950s, our metaphor for learning was the black box, and this was very much in the tradition of the behaviorist, B.F. Skinner. What we thought was that you can only measure behavior via learned and observed behavior, right? If I want to know whether someone learned something or not, I have to look at their behavior. And certainly that's a tool that still persists in our toolbox, but our metaphor has evolved. If you flash forward, for example, to later that century, Our metaphor was mind as a computer, and this came out of the cognitive information processing research. This is the notion that the brain really kind of functions like a computer. It was information in, a little bit of processing, and information out. And we began to play around with this notion of memory and stages and phases and short-term memory and long-term memory. And if you fast forward to the recent past, our memory has evolved even more, and our metaphor has evolved even more. We now think of the brain as a jungle. It is a living, ever-changing part of the human body, where just like in the jungle, leaves begin to sprout and grow. The same thing is happening in our brains. Every single experience that we have actually changes the nature of who we are as humans and as learners. So what we know is that intelligence is not fixed at birth, and we are experiencing this scientific revolution. The paradigms and what we're able to observe in our world is much different. So as I said, we know that intelligence isn't fixed at birth, that it's actually experiences that wire our brain. And so when you think about our job as educators and how we employ purposeful technology, for example, it's our job to design solutions that provide these rich learning experiences. I want to connect this notion of research and the paradigm shift and what we're seeing in learning science to STEM education. So this is the second moment where I'd love to hear from all of you. The question that's on the table or on the screen is, what is the purpose of STEM education? So again, take to Twitter, take to your chat window. What is the purpose of STEM education? And just like before, Christy's going to be our helpful moderator, and she's going to call out some of the responses and some of the trends that we're seeing. What is the purpose of STEM education? And think higher purpose here, right? Why is it important to have STEM education?
Okay, getting some great answers. Equip students to be global citizens with 21st century skills, higher level learning and experience, to engage students in science and math, increase awareness of possible future careers, improve society in those areas. So like I said, Dr. Mahoney, I'm getting some great answers here. Excellent. College freshman year still wipes out about 50% in science and math, which is another excellent point. So we want to ensure that they are successful in their college and career readiness as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was doing check, check, check next to my notes.
I got excited there.
I love it. I love it. That's exactly right. So when we think about the purpose of STEM education, we'll often hear about critical thinking, about inquiry mindsets, right, both developing and employing them, about being problem solvers and master problem solvers in our world. And our world is, as someone said, global, right? We're talking about a global citizenry and 21st century skills and higher levels of learning. So if we think about all of that in the context of how we at McGraw-Hill are thinking about STEM education, you can see that reflected in sort of our very basic disciplinary focus. So you can see here we're talking about a technology-driven society. You'll see the reference to critical thinking, inquiry-based problem solving in service of a broader citizenry. Right? How are we approaching our thinking around science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in service of this higher purpose and greater good? And when we think specifically about the benefits of K-12 STEM education, we've already heard from some of the folks on the line about some of the ways that it makes such a positive impact, right? There are so many benefits. So we've heard about the number of increased candidates qualified, not just for higher education, but who persist in math and science courses in higher education. We know that a strong K-12 STEM education actually increases the number of candidates who are qualified for jobs in industries that are high-tech, as well as industries that have been transformed by technology. So we're talking about financial services or biotechnology, even healthcare and hospitality and retail. So all of the places where the technology is becoming an integral part of the career path and lifelong learning. We know that a strong K-12 STEM education actually means broadened representation in STEM fields for women and minorities. And we know that it's critical for the sustained growth and stability of the U.S. economy. So the impact and the importance is clear when we think about how we at McGraw-Hill are helping in the formation of those STEM citizens. Again, we really have this mantra where we come back to the focus on the educator, focus on the learner, focus on the learning. We're thinking about how we take what we know about learning science and yet meaningfully apply that and integrate it into the art of teaching, what you all are doing masterfully day to day, and then designing purposeful technology. You'll hear us talk about purpose over and over again, because it's really where you help the students see their goals, set their goals, help them establish aspirations for college and career, and focus on meaningful outcomes, not just the usage of technology. So one of the ways that we go about focusing on the educator, focusing on the learner, and then transforming that into purposeful technology is through an ongoing research and design program. So we actually have done a series of studies where we talked to over 10,000 elementary, middle school, and high school educators. And in those conversations, the needs around what problems are we trying to solve and what are you facing every day became pretty clear. And there were 3 key takeaways of that research. The first key takeaway was that whatever experience we design and implement has to be easy to use and has to be easy to implement. This is probably intuitive to you. The second key takeaway is that whatever we design in those experiences has to be flexible enough to work into my classroom. And I'm going to show you some examples of direct quotes from this research that really bring this to life in a minute. But think about the array of devices and the parity or lack of parity in access to technology, for example, from school to school, district to district, state to state. And then finally, we know that that third key takeaway is that it absolutely has to be engaging. So if we unpack these each a little bit, and we start with that first key takeaway, making the solutions and the products and the implementations easy to use and easy to implement, what we heard were things like, it's got to be easy to access my lesson plans. And by the way, setting up for labs has to be easy. It can't be time consuming, and I've got to do this multiple times a day, for example. What we also heard was that there are these competing priorities, or at least integrated priorities, where everyone is required to balance across the disciplines. How am I dealing with literacy and mathematics literacy in addition to science? And so this is about ease of use when we're balancing all of those constraints and considerations in the classroom. The second key takeaway, and what we heard around flexibility, really focused on 3 core themes. So the first was this notion of having second language learners, where it is absolutely imperative to make accommodations and support in a scaffolded way the literacy needs of those students. And then secondly, what we heard was around access to technology, various times, various access and bandwidth demands, and the reliability or unreliability of that technology, as well as the actual number of devices. So this was about the variety of implementation models, the array of access, the array of access to different types of devices, and having models that adjust flexibly to any of those scenarios. And then finally, when we talk about making an engagement, what you told us was that the program has to be hands-on. It has to turn kids on to science, that the students had to be able to make connections to the real world. Relevance came up again and again. It had to be about the science, and if it wasn't both about the science and about engagement, we knew that it wouldn't capture students' attention, and what you were telling us was that was basically a minimum bar in order to keep them engaged in the learning. So this transformed into the basis of a model. And for us, what we really take is this integrated view of what we're hearing from you, as well as what we know about research in curriculum, pedagogy, and technology. And there's 3 different dimensions of this integrated approach. The first is where we say, look, how can we take the best in research around science and engineering practices, and how do we really focus on hands-on science and that overall design process, and marry that with mathematical practices, where yes, we're allowing students opportunities to practice their math skills, but we're also allowing them opportunities to analyze data, do things like create graphs in the context of these engineering challenges. And then finally, how are we integrating that with reading and writing and overall communication skills? Again, going back to this notion of presenting solutions to real-world challenges and being master problem solvers. So we have this model that relies on these 3 dimensions, and there are 5 principles of STEM education that guide the design and development within this model. And the experiences as we know them, based on your feedback, have to be experiential. The second principle is that those experiences need to be learner-focused. They absolutely have to be collaborative. Again, this notion of relevancy, the experiences must be relevant, and they must be interdisciplinary. So what we're going to do next is actually unpack each of these principles, and I want to do so through specific examples, and then I want to explicitly address purposeful technology within each of those examples. So what we'll do for each one of the principles actually is define the principle in kind of colloquial language, and then what we're going to talk about is what you're seeing on screen as the example, and then connect that to purposeful technology. So we'll start with the first principle, which is experiential, and basically this means learning through experience, right? We define this as learning through reflection on doing. And what you're seeing in the background here is actually a screenshot from a Learn Smart lab on osmosis. And for us, these labs are designed to determine precisely which learning objectives students have grasped, and then where they might need additional support. And what it does is engage those students in a highly realistic lab experience, and I'll talk about that in a little more depth in just a minute, that actually allows them to make mistakes as they're mastering and practicing the scientific method, as well as applying those basic skills and concepts. So when we talk about experiential and we talk about the affordances of technology, this is an example in this lab where the students can actually selectively apply permeable membranes. Then they can add distilled water to each of the beakers. They can wait for the fluids to level and stabilize. They get to record the height of each of the fissile tubes. And then they actually get to discuss the osmotic pressure based on data. So this is a place where purposeful technology is allowing for us to experiment, trial and error, and give the students multiple passes at conceptual development as well as skill development in a virtual environment that allows them to synchronously or asynchronously engage in the content. If we take a look at the second example, this is actually where we want to talk about being learner-focused. And not surprisingly, this is by definition when the student is at the center of the experience. And what I'm about to put on screen does require a little bit of explanation. As one of our learning scientists actually says, you're not supposed to read this diagram. You're just supposed to absorb the complexity of the diagram. So I'm going to talk you through this for a minute. This is actually data from one of our solutions, Alex. And what you're seeing here is an equation at the top of the screen. So in the middle of the top, you see a solution. Or rather the equation is in that blue box, and then the solution is at the bottom of the screen, in the middle, in that green box. And what this is illustrating are the multiple paths to get from blue to green, or to get from the equation to the solution. And what we know in adaptive systems, for example, remember I described adaptive systems as systems that are responsive, is that if we were to look at all of the ways that we as humans were able to predict how to get from green or blue to green, it would be the middle of the road. Sort of the shortest pathways in the middle are how most people would get from blue to green or solve that equation. And yet what you're seeing on the periphery are all of the other valid ways that our system has captured the solutions that the students have entered. So there's a multitude of fringe cases that we could have never predicted. And so the key takeaway here when we're thinking about purposeful technology is that we have to be able to accommodate those students on the fringes, those students who are unique problem solvers, and our models with technology have to be intentionally humble. What that means is that some of the inference models used in other adaptive programs make this assumption that you can predict all of the ways that students might answer the solution. Our stance is that's not the case. That purposeful technology has to be humble, it has to be responsive, and it has to account for all of the fundamental ways that students might utilize their knowledge to get from blue to green in unexpected ways. That's being truly learner-focused. If we look at the third principle is collaborative. Again, a very basic definition is any endeavor conducted by 2 or more parties working together. And so what you're seeing on screen here is actually an image from students in one of our everyday mathematics classes. classrooms. And these students are working on a collaborative activity. These are actually collaborative activities that are designed into the program at the lesson level, and they give you options for whole class collaboration, small group collaboration, or partner collaboration. And what we know is that from research that when it comes to interactive and purposeful technology, there's a positive impact of learning in a social context. So when we think about it, there are instances where a problem that seems beyond the capabilities of a child working alone can often be solved when appropriate manipulatives, like the interactive number line that you see them using here, are available, or they're allowed to interact with one another. And again, this is sort of intuitive. When you encounter a problem, you often turn to your left, turn to your right, go to your colleagues, go to your trusted friends, and you try and solve it in a social context. This is an example where you can leverage purposeful technology in order to enhance that collaboration space. The fourth principle I want to talk about is relevancy. And something is relevant if one topic is being connected to another in a way that makes it useful to consider both of them together. So the example that you're seeing on screen here is actually an excerpt from teacher materials. And this is another example from Everyday Mathematics. And what you're seeing is an activity that actually leverages students' real-world knowledge to build deeper conceptual understanding. So this is a daily routine. It's an attendance routine that's especially utilized in the younger grades, where the students get real-world applications of the content and mathematical practices of the lesson. And this is an instance where purposeful technology is actually the purposeful use and knowing when it's not necessary. So if you look closely on screen where it says before you begin, there's actually references to a dry eraser board and paper and sticky notes. Not every version of every purposeful interaction needs to include technology, right? A simple bar graph might do the job. So purposeful technology is absolutely about pragmatism. It means you know when to employ technology, for what purpose, it's the right tool at the right time, and knowing when to say, we absolutely can achieve this goal without technology. Right? So it might seem a little counterintuitive, but purposeful technology is also about pragmatism. The last principle I want to talk about is interdisciplinary, and this is when we're relating more than one branch of knowledge to one another. And in this instance, what you're seeing on screen is actually an example of a third grade simulation. It's called Fossil Dig. This was actually developed in partnership with Concord Consortium for Inspire Science. And this particular screenshot is actually in an exercise where the students are addressing a standard related to unity and diversity. So the students are asked to analyze, interpret data from the fossils, and then provide evidence of the organisms and the environments which they lived long ago. The first level of the simulation actually allows the students to go in an open-ended, user-initiated way and determine where they want to begin and actually start their archaeological dig. And from there, the students are able to explore in an open-ended way on their own. And once the student discovers a fossil, they can click on it to find out more about it. And when they do so, the technology allows for immediate feedback. So they're getting personal pacing and exploration of the learning. The student could also, alternatively, and choice and control is a big element here, and controlled choice and control. They can move to another site and start looking at the dig, or they can randomly return to different areas, which we found in our research engagement and motivation. The students, once they select a fossil, will actually get a question pertaining to that animal, which is what you're seeing in the upper right-hand corner. And this is where technology can really harness the power of immediacy, right? They're getting immediate supported scaffolding in the form of perhaps feedback that would have had to come with a parent who was sitting alongside of that student, or from a teacher after they raised their hand. So if the student answers the question correctly, they actually get immediate feedback that validates their understanding. Correct, that organism lives on land, for example. But what you're seeing on this particular screen is what happens when the student answers incorrectly. That student is actually given immediate feedback that not only indicates the misunderstanding, but actually provides direct instruction around why the answer was incorrect. Again, this can be particularly powerful when you have a classroom full of students engaging in this archaeological dig, and they're all going at different paces, and yet you have a single teacher there to support. So when we think about purposeful technology, it's through connecting to real-world phenomenon and topics that transcend subject areas. So it's interdisciplinary because, yes, these students are engaging in science-related standards, but they are also in these activities required to employ mathematical skills. They're required to employ some of their social studies standards. So it was intentionally designed to integrate math, science, and social studies along with technology and literacy. We're going to move to the next section here. So we've talked about this model of STEM education and the 5 principles related to STEM education. I want to think a little bit about how you currently use data to evaluate impact on student learning. So this is going to be our 3rd and final question. I'm going to ask folks to do the same thing, which is go to our poll question. And this time it's a little bit different. You should see a quick poll appearing on screen. And you're going to see some options for the question. What data or records of experience do you currently use to evaluate impact on student learning? We're going to ask you to select one of the following. Right? Are you using data that are the results of high-stakes assessments? Are you using data or records that are based on classroom-based formative assessment, student self-reporting, or a combination of all of the above? So that poll is in progress. And again, the question is, what data or records of experience are you using to evaluate impact on student learning? And Christy's going to help us out with the big reveal after we get the preponderance of respondents here.
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to give them just a few more minutes. We have over 50% that have voted, so we're going to give everybody just a few more seconds to vote. But
Excellent.
I can just give you an idea. I guess I shouldn't sway the voting, but I can give you an idea that what I'm seeing, Shawn, is that over 75%, large majority, is a combination of all of the above.
Yeah. Excellent. And again, if I think about, we're talking about STEM, a hypothesis-based world, that would have been my hypothesis. And that's certainly the way that we're thinking about data and records of experience.
So I've closed the poll.
Thank you, Christy.
I'm sorry. So I've gone ahead and closed the poll, and basically the combination of all the above, and then the second highest was the classroom-based formative assessment.
Classroom-based formative assessment came in second. Excellent. Thank you, ma'am. And so when we think about data, we actually define that as records of experience. And I have a colleague, John Behrens, who uses that terminology. And he intentionally uses that terminology because records of experience can look like and sound like a multitude of things, right? It could be quantitative, it could be qualitative. And as we saw in the poll, you all are using all of the records of experience at your disposal to make the most informed decision. And you might use different types of data at different times. That's very similar to the approach that we're taking as well. And that's both before, during, and after development. And what you're seeing on screen here is actually one example of what we talk about as iterative design. So if you recall that balance slide that we had earlier, we're constantly balancing between research and design, these hypotheses about what problem we're trying to solve, and then validating those intentions. And this actually is a picture from a design session just 2 days ago in our office here in Columbus, where we had all of our solution architects, so think of these as subject matter experts, our mathematicians, our former classroom teachers, instructional designers, user experience designers, our developers, our creative designers, who were all in a session literally asking themselves about how to optimize the lesson experience for students in an elementary science program. And those intentions, those design intentions, are what we then turn around, for example, and validate in the field. So this is an example of where we're doing iterative research, where we're actually going out and talking to educators and students on an ongoing basis and testing those hypotheses. We're asking questions about how to improve the design, how to maximize student time on task. We're really looking across what we talk about as the 4 E's: ease of use, engagement, efficiency, and effectiveness. So we're looking for indicators of all of those elements. And ultimately, that culminates most often in our research in some type of summative research or gold standard research. So what you're seeing on screen here actually harkens back to one of the earlier examples we utilized from Alex. Remember the blue to green and the map of all the peripheral answers? This happens to be one graph showing the results of one research question. So we're really like coming down from the 30,000-foot level to the granular level. But again, this is one graph showing the results of one research question that was part of a bigger study at Big Bear Middle School in California. And this study, just at the most basic level, was actually looking at 3 groups. So you see control group 1, control group 2, and Alex. And essentially they were looking at 8th grade algebra readiness courses, and they were looking at the students' results on the California Standards Test. And what they did was take control group number 1, which had about 84 students in the group, and compare that to control group 2 and their performance, which had about 107 students, and then compared that to the experimental group, which was utilizing Alex, and that had an N of about 100. And what they were looking at in control 1 and control 2 was what they called, quote, lecture and practice. So this was your basic algebra readiness course taught using a textbook compared to Alex, which is that digital adaptive solution. And what you can see in this instance is the increase in the mean score. So they actually administered the 7th grade California Standards Test to all of the students as a baseline, and then they re-administered it at the end of the year looking for those gains. And what you see is that the points increase for the students utilizing Alex more than doubled from the increase in the control group. So this is one example, again, of a much larger and contextualized study, but where we're constantly looking around the effectiveness of the solution and how it's making an impact on learners. So if we kind of bring this full circle and think about purposeful technology, research, different models for STEM education, one of the questions that we often get is about the models and tools that one might use at the classroom level or even at the school or district level to help think about purposeful technology and what that means. And so what you're seeing on screen is actually the SAMR model, and many of you might be familiar with it. It was developed by Dr. Ruben Fuentedura, and essentially it's one tool for assessing the possible impact and the decision-making around when you integrate technology. And it's important to note that the model itself actually shows progression. So you progress from substitution to redefinition and then sometimes back around, so it can be full cycle. It's also a relative model, which basically says, what were you doing before compared to what are you doing now? And it's that delta where you're really asked to focus on the learning. So it's not that redefinition in and of itself is any better than augmentation, but it's really about what are you trying to accomplish and what is the purpose. So the question that one often uses when they're employing the SAMR model is, what do we gain by integrating technology? And that as you move from left to right, yes, you're arguably more invisibly weaving technology into the curriculum, but really what you're asking yourself is, how can I enhance the overall experience? So when you think about the model, it's got 4 steps, right? This relative progression model. And the first step is substitution, where you basically substitute a tool that doesn't really give you any functional change, but you're utilizing technology to do so. And I'm going to show you an example in just a minute. We'll actually talk a little bit of STEAM. We're going to add arts to the mix. When we think about augmentation, you can think about the technology acting as the tool substitute, and it might have a slight functional improvement, right? So think no functional change, slight functional improvement, all the way to modification, which says, you know what, now we're actually starting to change things a little bit. There is some task redesign that's happening here. And then finally, with redefinition, you're looking at tasks that were previously inconceivable. So this becomes a bit of a game changer. So what we'll do is apply this model to an example in the arts. And what you're seeing on screen here is actually a screenshot from our Solution Music Studio. And I'll describe to what you're seeing on screen, and then we'll talk about applying the SAMR model to that. So kind of above the fold or above the tiles, you can see a rhythm section on the left and solo instruments on the right. And what you can actually do as a student is isolate in each of those instruments. So you could decide to play the drum set, or you could decide to play the piano and isolate that sound, or you could isolate one of the solo instruments, or you could play them in concert. And then what you can do with the tiles below is actually start and stop the music. You can start to play around with the theme. You can start to play around with the speed and the cadence. So when we think about how this relates to SAMR model, you can imagine a classic example from music class where perhaps you've got sheet music in front of you and you're about to practice. If you think about SAMR, an example of substitution where we would say, you know what, we're going to take that sheet music, we're going to turn it into a PDF, and we're going to load it online, and now instead of having the music in front of you, you've got the music on the computer screen. Right? That would be substitution. If we want to think about augmentation, you might say, well, we're going to load that PDF, but we're also going to load it with an MP3 file. So now you can read the music and you could play the song and have a sample. And then if we start thinking about modification, you start thinking about, well, what if we actually loaded that PDF and we integrated that song file so that the students could play with the rhythm and they could start to explore the feel of the music and they could speed things up or speed things down. And then when you get to redefinition, right, it's more like what you're seeing on screen here, where there's a completely new task. You can isolate the sounds, you can change the actual pitch, you can change the rhythm, for example. And now a task that would have been previously inconceivable, one student wouldn't have been able to play the piano and a solo instrument at the same time and play with the rhythm, becomes integrated and enhanced by technology. So think about, what are we trying to accomplish and what are we gaining by integrating the technology? Because if we come full circle and think about where we started, right, purpose is always the key to what we're trying to accomplish. So what we learned from Quincy Jones was that technology isn't the thing that creates beauty and greatness, that what we have to do is stay focused on purpose. And so whether that purpose is making beautiful music or it's impacting the lives of learners, it's not technology in and of itself or technology alone that is the key to transformation. It's purposeful technology. So with that, I'm going to move to the questions slide and ask Christy to help us moderate. Let's see what questions come up in the audience.
Okay, so yes, great information. I mean, just awesome. It has me excited about making sure you focus on learners and using the art of technology to integrate with the art of teaching. So I'm going to give everybody a chance to see if they have any questions. Now, keep in mind, we may not be able to get to all of your questions, but we will answer them specifically to you as well at the end of this webinar. So we'll be able to do that for you as well. So I'm going to give everyone just a minute to type in their questions.
That's great. And Christy, we're just reminding folks at McGraw-Hill K-12.
Yes, please tweet us at McGraw-Hill K-12 or through the question box here in the webinar. Okay, so one of the questions I'm getting is, are there any examples for us to refer to or share with other teachers? So I think there was some powerful information there. What's the best way that we'll be able to share this out?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So one of the things that we'll be doing is actually recording this webinar. So that's option number one. And secondly, what we can do, and we'll share some contact information past this question screen, is if there's a specific example that you saw, we have one of our McGraw-Hill team members, Rhonda, who will be able to bundle together some lean examples and talking points for you.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, let's see if I can get a few more questions out here.
Sounds good. Thanks, Christy.
Just lots of thank yous. That it was a great informative session and program. And of course, everybody wants other examples, like, for example, one of them foreign language and one of them for the SMAR, for the SAMR, for the model that you showed.
Okay, got it. We're taking those notes down.
Yeah, and like I keep saying, great ideas, implementation ideas for even some of the younger students like kindergarten. Do you have any suggestions there?
Excellent. Yep, kindergarten students. And I automatically go back to some of those rituals and routines that I sort of alluded to in everyday math, for example. And yet what we've got so far on this short list, and we'll cull through the chat window, we've got foreign language examples, kindergarten students. We've got more examples of the SAMR model. This is really helpful.
Yeah, so I think you did such a great job that like I said, we're getting thank yous, and we'll allow people. The Twitter feed is always open, so we have somebody that monitors that daily. So feel free at any time to direct any questions that way as well. And then additional questions about our programs can be right here from Rhonda Albritton, and Rhonda will be monitoring those as well. Be aware that also Rhonda will be sending out the links to the recording and any other handouts or information that we'll share with you guys. So thanks very much for attending today. We truly appreciate it, and look forward to hearing from you again.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Pleasure all mine. Thanks for your participation and being present.
All right, this will end this webinar. Thanks again.